You know, one of the funniest tweets I've seen in a very, very long time happened a couple days ago when David Hogg, who's the kid that survived that school shooting a while back, he tweeted a video of some people in that had stolen a Russian tank in the Ukraine right now, and they were teaching each other how to basically drive and steal more of these Russian tanks. And he was praising them getting armed with tanks. This is David Hogg, this like rabid anti-gun, anti-self-defense guy. Anyway, it was, the hypocrisy knows no bounds. Today we have a cool show. Let's get into it. He has a plan, she has a plan, and you get to pay for it regardless.
The best way to get someone motivated is to stand for something strongly, deeply, passionately.
Subscribe to Disenthrall. Do as you're told.
Greetings, future nuclear holocaust survivors. Welcome back to Disenthrall. I will be Patrick Smith. Today, well, let me do a couple housekeeping stuff first, and then I'll introduce our guests and the show that we have today. Number one, I'm not going to apologize for the infrequency of the shows recently. We've had a lot of stuff going on at Float. We have a big release coming up end of March. Don't tell anybody. It's going to be a lot of cool stuff, but everybody is really, really heads down working overtime on that right now. So there has not been a lot of free time for much of anything, especially not philosophy, ever since we released the Anti-Subjectivist manifesto, which you saw on the channel. I think it was the last video on the channel, actually. So the next thing I want to talk about is exactly that. So when we put out content and we create philosophy and we make arguments on this channel for 10 years or more now, I have always said, look, I want to know when I'm wrong. If you think I'm wrong, if you have a counter argument, I'm not running from you. I'm not mad at you. I'm happy that you exist, and I'm excited to engage with you to find out if I'm wrong, because I value truth over ego. Unlike a lot of people that you call them out or you try and engage with them and they run. Mark Passio or Yaron Brook for objectivism, for example. They refuse to engage when you have counter arguments to them. I never, ever want to be that person. And to that end, we have today's show. Welcome to the show, everyone. We have Christian, my co-author of the Anti-Subjectivist manifesto that you guys recently saw. Welcome to the show, Christian.
Hey, how's it going?
And we also have Kenneth, who is one of the such people I was just talking about. He watched the manifesto video on Odysee, had some disagreements, and rather than cussing at us in the comments like most people do or calling us names, he actually spent some time writing out arguments, counter arguments, and then when he got pushback, he didn't get nasty. He continued to engage, and that guarantees you basically a free pass to come on the show and talk through it with us every single time. So welcome to the show, Kenneth. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I like to argue.
Awesome. All right. What's up, ANCAP? I see you in the comments. Good to see you. What's up, Bob? Hey, Josiah. Good to see you guys. Welcome. All right. So we're gonna have a chill conversation where people are gonna hopefully tell us that we're wrong, and we're hopefully going to learn some truth that we didn't know before this thing got started. But before that, I would like to just spend a few minutes getting to know our guest a little bit, if that's cool with him. Can you tell us just a little bit about yourself? Tell us where you are or are not politically, and let's just kind of get to know you a little bit first.
Well, my politics are a bit weird to describe. I would summarize it with several different things. I'm a polyarchist. I believe the state is fundamentally ineliminable, but still fundamentally evil. And as such, I don't think trying to eliminate the state is a wise idea. In fact, it can have unforeseen ramifications. We can end up with something worse. On top of that, I'm a localist. So authority should be limited locally as possible and be as possible. Basically, I take that a little bit from the Tower of Babel story. That's kind of where I'm at politically. I started out as a minister, and then changed churches after an argument. And then later, my wife called her favorite Bible dictionary garbage. And now I basically live to myself and live a simple life, teach catechism, occasionally and try to help them figure out their way. And that's about all there is to me.
So you're like the opposite of an actual anarchist. You're like I want a lot of rulers.
No, well, in a sense, because they're ineliminable. I can't get rid of them. I don't think there is any coherent or cogent way to get there.
So do you recognize any of them as valid? Or you just want a bunch of warlords fighting each other?
I don't think the question makes any sense. It's like, do I want flooding or do I want a hurricane? It doesn't matter. If there's going to be a hurricane, I build a shelter and I deal with it. So
at what scale in between like two people interacting freely and say the size of the United States population, at what number in between there does it flip from becoming obviously easy to not have a ruler to, as you say, like impossible to not?
I think if you have any group of people at any length of time, a ruler will emerge. The more disparate people are in their differences in values, the more aggressive the authority will become, and human nature will just cause it to happen. And so I don't think it's eliminable because we're tribal primates.
Well, I mean, okay, so my question was specifically like, because it's obviously eliminable because you and I are in an anarchic relationship right now. The three of us are. My family is. All of my friends in Dallas are. My neighbors are, except for the ones that vote for me to be taxed or whatever, right? So at some level, at some scale, it's perfectly possible and it's perfectly eliminatable, right? So at what scale are you saying that it becomes uneliminable, and what's your justification for that number?
I don't think it is on any sustained relationship. Over time, somebody will take the lead. Sometimes people are kind and they basically talk to others and they listen and they respond. But in almost any group, a man will become, or a woman, it's usually a male, but it will become the person who sets the tone for the whole group. He may have consensual relations where he goes back and forth, but it's still going to be a social hierarchy. And the more differences there are in the group and the more sustained relationships there are, the more codify laws. I don't think it's something you put a number on. I think it's just...
I think we're having a little bit of like connection glitching. Can you just like refresh your browser or make sure that you don't have a lot of stuff running on your machine? It might help it out.
I will hit the refresh button.
Thank you. We'll see you again in a second. It's just a little choppy. I'm hoping we can clear it up here.
Yeah.
All right. I see you back now.
I am killing the Emacs demon in the background.
All right. Nice.
That's the only thing that was running.
Okay. Well, I think it already sounds better. Well, hopefully that holds out. Christian, I've been dominating the conversation. Do you have any thoughts or questions?
Yeah. I mean, well, I said this. Well, it seems to be kind of like a stance of political pragmatism, which is not uncommon for a lot of people to have, even people with anarchist tendencies or leanings, which it sounds like is a case of what we have here, especially since we started all of this with the idea that the government is inherently like an evil, or another way to put it would be like an unjust authority in like an ethical perspective, but it's more of and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to be more of like a position of a pragmatic one. It's like, I don't see a method by which the government, not me, but you, I'm putting words in your mouth is what I'm doing. There's no position that you can see by which the government can be eliminated in a manner that doesn't cause X undesirable thing or just immediately replace itself. And so your position is to try to obfuscate government to the extent that it is minimally destructive, I guess. Is that a fair representation?
That's a fairly fair representation. Because I believe if the government was eliminated altogether, several different people would compete for authority, and eventually the competition would lead to probably a just outright muscle man with not even the cardboard cutout limitations that we try to create for them now. So it basically, human nature is such where We desire more, we try to acquire more, and we will do almost anything possible to get it. And because we're hierarchical mammals, it's going to go ugly. Kind of like our two evil empires fighting right now through Ukraine.
I do kind of want to say that there does seem to be a bit of like a generalization going on with this like concept of human nature that I think I would in a lot of cases be willing to run with, but since like the whole underpinning of like the argument here is this we'll say conflict-oriented human nature, I can't speak for most people, and I think you might be right about like a large degree of people, but I could tell you that I personally, based off of my own ethical burdens that I've placed on myself, wouldn't try to rule over you in any way, shape, or form. Most likely something you could expect based off of the context that this conversation was born under. So I'm curious what makes you so confident to use a generalization in a way that suggests like even 3 or 4 people couldn't form a union in a manner that doesn't lead to one of them having like an unjust hierarchy.
Well, 3 or 4, you could actually do it, but there would still be a hierarchy. The more you have and the more differences you have, the more non-consensual it will become. Basically, we're a lot like chimps, but smarter. And you see this phenomenon with chimps all the time. I mean, people thought that war was unique to humans till they saw chimps going to war. Tool use isn't unique to us. Chimps use it pretty much the same way. We're just smarter, and it's probably we're smarter because we have better language capacity.
So your argument is not about what's right. You're just usually when somebody asks you like how you identify politically, it's a question that basically means how do you want the world to exist? And it sounds like you responding by telling me how it does exist, not so much how you want it to exist, right? Is that fair? So how would you want it to exist?
How would I want it to exist? Where basically nobody coerced any other people. They shared freely in order to help others. And basically, you and I would have a very similar approach towards how it should exist. It's not going to exist that way.
And well, I'm happy to hear you say that. And of course, I agree. I wonder if you would also agree that intelligent enough or advanced enough apes would be capable of suppressing their biological caveman urges to cooperate at a small to medium-sized society, according to that rubric that you described.
No, a lot of times I'll throw in different metaphysical or religious or mythological illusions, but we don't have that in common. I'm a firm believer of keeping things in common. But no, I really don't, because I forgot the name of the study. There was a study in which they checked the development of children over against chimps of the same age. And the chimps frequently did better than the children until the children were allowed to communicate with one another, and then the children smoked the apes. We are basically, our intelligence is at its best. We're like a giant virtual machine.
So you're not willing to entertain the hypothetical that, like, if a group of more advanced or smarter apes, like you and I, we understand these principles. We both want the world to exist in a consensual way. And if we found more of us, people like us, you don't think a society would function?
No, I think we're outliers. And even if we weren't, it would only take, say, 3 to 5% of a society to overturn that order.
And you don't think...
It only takes a minority to just undermine it all.
But, I mean, if there were enough of us, we could resist that undermining, right?
When that happens, then people will line up in groups, and they'll begin picking sides. You know, one will jump in on one side, one will jump in on another, because there's usually ambiguity in those conflicts. And it'll look a lot like Ukraine today.
So what you're saying? So what you're saying is, Kathy Newman, is the worst case scenario is that if we attempt for consensual anarchy, we end up where we are now.
Probably worse.
Why
because
worse?
We got where we are now because we instituted lots of things over time. You know, people cutting off the heads of kings, people theorizing various models for human rights and things like that. And that has effectively, things are like the tax man used to be a lot worse than what he is now. And so we've gone a long ways. Things are a lot better. And if there's, I always like to make the joke, what's the difference between the government and the mob? And people will say, I don't know. And I'll just say, neither do I. And well, if we jettison all these structures and we go for just that consensual relationship, that progress will basically be wiped away because the people that do take control will behave like the mob, just without any pretenses.
I mean, would you agree that like the arrow of history is progressing more and more towards individual consent and farther away from these large centralized power structures?
I don't think we have enough history in order to make that assessment. I think what we're doing is we're seeing us vacillate between extremes. And we've seen times in history when it has been more individualistic, and then it's swung over towards a much more collective model. And then we swung back over to individual. We may actually be seeing it swing the other way.
Interesting. So, I mean, would you agree that you would call yourself an anarchist if we're talking about what you want to see in the world? You just don't think it's possible.
If we could talk about what I want to see in the world, there would only be one thing that stands in the way. Is because I'm a fairly traditional Christian. I don't know if you've had many discussions with Christians who identify as anarchists. There's a fundamental contradiction when you say God is king, and then you argue for anarchy.
Thank you. All the conversations I've had with so-called self-titled Christian anarcho-Christians begin with any premise except the one you just stated. Like, at least you see the contradiction up front with that label.
Yes, go ahead.
I'd be happy to have you back for a discussion on all of these topics. We could probably go on for hours on that alone.
Yeah, if I had started talking about that one, I would wind up taking us off into talking about giants and things like that, which is perfectly applicable to Ukraine. But we go off into weird, crazy land for people that aren't inducted into it. So probably better move on from that one and do that another time if you ever want to.
Interesting. Well, I'm always looking for good conversations, literally. Okay, so let's start getting to the matter at hand. So you saw the Anti-Subjectivist Manifesto, and you had some comments, and I think the most charitable way to have these discussions where we have somebody that disagrees is to just sort of hand the floor to you and let you make your case and tell us where we were wrong. So if you're willing and able, I'm happy to shut up and let you do that.
All right. Now, before I go on, my view about how we conceive of morals is that most modern people suffer underneath what I call dissimulation, where we're unwilling to look at reality as it really is, and we create a model or an illusion which glosses over things. And today in the modern world, we like to think of ourselves as more rational than we really are. What I think happens with people when they come to moral truths and things like that is that they glimpse something. And then when they wrestle with it, this can't be the case. They start trying to evaluate it through reductive logic, and that's how you communicate with people. But you never actually get there by reductive logic. And so in some ways, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm arguing that the explanation you're using to get to your position doesn't quite go there. If that makes any sense.
I think I'm having a break in the fabric of reality I need to correct. So I'm gonna thank Jim Jesus for his super chat. Thank you, sir, for the $2. He says, I'm mad I can't buy crocodile because of the Russian embargo. F in the chat. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate your $2 bit of wisdom. All right, F in the chat for Jim. I'm going to hand the floor now over to you, and I'm going to fix the fabric of reality behind me, and let's do it. So, floor is yours, sir.
All right. On all 3 points, the second point would actually probably be the last, because obviously we agree on the laws of logic because we're discussing with the laws of logic. I would give a constructive criticism on your first point, is that kind of like when we're doing right here, I obviously have a very different metaphysics. And rather than just saying reality is reality, you might be able to catch more fish if you say that reality is what we experience together, the common experience. Because then you eliminate the solipsist and any other type of objection, because they function in reality just like everybody else. if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think I'll say this, and then I'll give it to Christian. So I think the original version of the document didn't have too much on solipsism, and I think I sort of tried to flesh it out because I hate that objection. It's annoying. I feel like it's a waste of time. I feel like if you're actually a solipsist that actually questions whether anybody else outside your brain exists, that moral philosophy is not for you in general at its base anyway. So it's anyway, that's my thoughts. Christian, do you have any on what he just said?
Just to give the pedantic metaphysical objection to the idea of the common experience, if you're a solipsist, you don't believe that there's a common experience. You could maybe craft a scenario where we imaginary people in the solipsist figmented world are having a common experience, but they don't see us imaginary people as experiential or moral entities in any meaningful sense, or at least there's no rational basis to come to that conclusion. So I'm not strongly against your idea of common experience. I think it gets to the heart of what we were trying to get across in that section, but I do think that at that point, being intellectually genuine to the solipsist, I think it doesn't really answer their critique, which we didn't either, but at least we called them out by name, I suppose.
In retrospect, I think we may have given them more words than they deserved in that manifesto, actually.
Yeah, exist. I remember reading a story about one guy who said that he was a solipsist, and the guy that was debating with him got a pot of boiling water, is about to pour it over, and he jumped up and he goes, "What? It doesn't exist anyway."
Yeah, there's a really famous debate between a man named Henry Putnam. I'm sorry, he's a really famous philosopher. I should know his first name. But he had a debate with a solipsist, and he started the debate in his opening statement, and he said, "Shoot me and everyone in the crowd, or concede the debate." And it was a really interesting debate.
I have done that to people who say that humanity is fundamentally evil and a virus. I'll sometimes pass a knife across the floor, and I say, "Well, then do the world a favor." And they never do.
Yeah.
Reduce that number by 1.
Yeah.
If you really want to do it, you want to write a manifesto, but I'm like, you don't really believe that because you believe your life is valuable.
And probably also believes that he's one of the good ones. And if he stabbed himself, he would be proving that he was one of the good ones, and also proving that all humans were not evil.
Yeah. So I like to pick on that one too. I hate that humanity is a virus or humanity is evil. That's one of my pet peeves.
What's the word for it when they just hate humanity?
Misanthropy.
A misanthrope. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, the floor is still yours. I mean, you're driving the ship.
So we might as well go on to the state of nature, because that's where the rubber hits the road. I have to actually prepare the floor a little bit, because remember, I've already talked about how we're not quite as rational as we think we are. A fundamental part of all human thought is myth and mythology. So when I call the state of nature a myth, it doesn't necessarily, I qualified by saying that it didn't exist, that model. So it does mean it in that case, but a myth isn't always something that's not true. A myth is a story which encodes values or important truths, or at least for the people that say it. And so specifically, the state of nature is a creation myth. Just your creation myths tend to come in one of 3 varieties. You have variety number 1. The world is all chaos. It's usually full of violence, or things are flowing against each other. And then one god steps up to the monsters. He slays the monsters, and then he establishes his temple usually and begins to rule and imposes order. A second creation myth involves the fall from a state which explains the current things, where things were good and then we fell and we created the current institutions we see. Third creation myth is where the gods basically overthrow the preceding gods because they were evil and they abused them and they were tyrannical, and then they institute a new system. The creation myth that Hobbes created, in the 18th century, they knew nothing about anthropology or human origins or anything like that. it was a complete blank slate. So it's small wonder that he channeled everything and he modified it and ordered everything according to the first form of the creation myth I articulated. You have a war of all against all, nasty, brutish, and short. That basically the sovereign steps in, he conquers the chaos, and then he imposes his will upon the world, and it brings peace and order. It is literally a creation myth, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
Christian,
I don't have
you or me
any-
first. Go ahead, Christian.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, I don't have with that first part, like, I think that's actually like a really salient critique specifically of the Leviathan. I think it's very fair, especially like with the parallels that you've drawn, whether it was intentional or not, that Hobbes had something like that in mind. I mean, like the sovereign as God is essentially like Hobbes's point at the end of Leviathan. And so, but I think I do just kind of want to make sure we guide the conversation a little bit. Like, while we use the premise of Hobbes's state of nature, we don't necessarily have the same origin point or same subjects. It's just the most closely related perspective of the state of nature, which makes it a useful referential tool.
All right, hold on just a second.
You're fine.
Yeah, no problem.
Most people inside schizophrenia.
He did.
Yeah.
That's very good of him. Now, I've got to keep talking to the people. I'll play with you later. Okay?
Kids are the best.
All right, go ahead and go play with Mommy and Luke.
I have
You would be bored.
I have a play date scheduled for myself and my daughter tonight. We're going to do Minecraft in real life, which is where we pretend Minecraft is real in our house and we go on adventures. So as soon as this show's over, I'm in Minecraft. So
Yeah, I will be playing with my two children. It has been rather poignant for him because I'm homeschooling him because I don't want to turn him over to the state for his education. The state is evil, and I would actually argue that it is literally demonic. But we were getting towards the end of it was a children's version of the Iliad, and then he started hearing the news about the Ukraine. He was associating it with what he was reading in the Iliad, and he goes, "This is bad." They go, "Yeah, war is evil."
wow, that's awesome. All right, so Christian, were you done, or I think you were?
Yeah. I think I know we're just kind of like building up to the topic on the state of nature, but I did just want to go ahead and throw that out there that while since we took a little break, just a real quick version, while Hobbes's conclusion is not only do I believe super arbitrarily limited to fit that sort of creation myth ethos that like raises up humanity above everything else, but also comes to the conclusion that like, oh, God kings are like a good thing that we need. The reason that I like to associate Hobbes is because it gives people a jumping off point, because they can make those what are a lot of times like sort of nasty preconceived notions regarding a topic. But when you're talking about something as large in scope as a state of nature, it can be useful to like have that frame of reference and then be able to tweak it from there. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, and my comment was, I'll skip the stuff in common that with Christian really, but my comment was that our usage of the state of nature is sort of even more basal than maybe Hume's conception. Like when we talk about the difference that we have with solipsists, and we talk about having a shared experience, that basal shared experience of reality that we all exist in is the closest thing to the state of nature that we're talking about. We're talking about existence. It's almost synonymous in our usage. State of nature is just what is. We haven't gotten any stories yet. We haven't gotten any creation myths yet. It's just existence.
Well, that also leads us to might as well talk about and define nature, because there's no use talking about state of nature if you don't define nature. I would actually say I'm going to channel my inner Greek right here, even though I don't have an ounce of Greek blood. I'm just thoroughly Germanic. Germanic and a little bit of Choctaw mixed in, but if it's a Germanic nation, I've got it in me. Nice. But Usia, which is
I'm Swiss and Cherokee. Like that's interesting.
So
go ahead.
Let's get our terminology out, and because I don't read primarily modern philosophy, I read ancient philosophy, and then I like to read science books, and then modern criticism of ancient literature. So the first term I'm going to like when we're talking about nature, I like to introduce because it's kind of similar to what y'all are talking about, is ousia. A lot of times we translate that as nature, which we can actually call that being or the thing as it is. And then nature, I'm going to go from Latin to Greek because it's easier to make the bridge. Nature is natura, which is from the participle form of nasco. And what it denotes is being born, the act by which something is being born. And jumping from that, a similar concept in Greek is physis. And yes, I know what it sounds like, and it deserves all the jokes. Yes, I use modern Greek pronunciation almost exclusively because my Greek professor taught me modern Greek pronunciation, which I'm rather thankful for. But physis is from the Greek verb theo, which is to sprout or to shoot forth. And so properly, the ousia was treated as substantia in Latin, and then a lot of times transliterated as substance in English. And I think that was a huge mistake on the part of the Latins, but hey, they didn't ask me. I wasn't born yet.
In ancient Greece, I think it would be phaikous, right?
I have no idea how you're pronouncing that.
I think that would be the ancient pronunciation, phaikous. Anyway, go ahead.
Don't look at me. Don't look at me. I'm a bona fide English speaker here. So,
but I never had a professor, so when I learned, I only learned the ancient pronunciations. So that's all I know.
Most of them are the ancient pronunciations. What they always recommend is Erasmian pronunciation, and Erasmus was never used as a pronunciation for Greek, except by academics who could hold Greece into contempt.
Yeah, so
there's a colonial mindset among a lot of academics towards the actual Greeks, and it's really kind of makes no sense to me.
So the last thing I'll say before I hand it back to you on the state of nature is that when we talk about the state of nature, we're talking about that state of existence that includes that. In the beginning of the show, when we talked about you don't think it's possible for humanity to elevate itself out of its more basal instincts, that's the state of nature we're describing in anti-subjectivism, and we're talking about people's ability to choose to act on a higher philosophical and conceptual level than those base instincts.
And that's why I'm going back to our Greek terms, how a thing propagates itself, how it carries itself. Which is also part of the problem with almost every modern natural law theory, is they never take into any consideration on what the word actually means, and they come up with this hidden thing. It's like, does it yield success? Does it yield harmony with your neighbor? If yes, then it's natural law. If no, then you're doing something stupid.
Oh, you're saying that's what they say.
Yeah, people have these high, lofty, imaginary laws, and it's basically how a thing propagates itself, how it succeeds, and how it reproduces, and that is natural law. But sorry, I got on a digression right there. But that's easy for me to do. So when part of the problem with the state of nature theory is it's 18th century people, virtually all of them, 18th century people speculating about humanity in their...
Can I interrupt? I hate to interrupt you, but we're not talking about the same things that the people in the 1800s were talking about. Like, is there any way that I could convince you to really kind of target your criticisms at what we're describing?
I'm narrowing it down.
Okay, I'll shut up then. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm working my way out. Y'all are working very much within... Nathaniel, you got to go and stay in there. Or do you just want to stay in here and listen?
I'm going to stay here and listen.
All right. Can you be quiet? If you're quiet, you can stay in here and listen. But if you make noise, I'll send you out. Okay? I love you. Sorry, I have a soft spot for my children.
Good. It sounds like you're a peaceful negotiating parent too. So that's amazing. Good job.
Yeah. So thank you. But it's built into this tradition. And I think that when we talk about humanity in its basal form, if you're talking about the state of nature and you're not including modern biology and anthropological research, you're dealing with basically the anthropological version. So, like, even though I'm a moral realist and y'all aren't, you can actually achieve a functional moral realism with some of the anthropological research because humans have common behavior types in these basal states that we can study. And it's not a dog-eat-dog world because they tend to be more consensual and cooperative on a small scale. It's when humans get really populated that we just become absolute jerks, or when we encounter a foreign tribe, then we'll kill them anyway. But so, and then even on the nature is red in tooth and claw is only half of the truth. Human beings, being tribal primates, our entire societal structure, and even I would argue our psychology, like I was mentioning earlier, on how we cooperate with children, is based on not having might makes right. It's built into us, hard-coded. Even biologically, we are physically made not just of human cells. Each of the human cells is an individual organism, but we're also populated with and need genetically non-human components just to be us. We're a collective organism in ourselves. And so you can't have a multicellular organism if it's only might makes right, because the organisms cooperate and they work with each other.
So I think this is actually an important discussion and one that dips a bit into the realm of metaphysics. So bear with me if I get a little long in the tooth on this one. But there's a conception of what classifies itself as an entity, right? And this conversation is one that is like literally thousands of years old and is unsettled. But I think when we are talking about entities existing in the state of nature, and we talk about things like ants and deer and elk and humans, we're typically referring to like what would be considered like a complete entity, which all of its like contiguous components are amalgamized into one class of entity. And while I don't think you're biologically or scientifically wrong in stating that like we're a multicellular organism and to some level there is cooperation, it's more, one, there's the entity thing where we can talk about these things as like complete units, which classify as an entity. But even if that's debatable, I think even just from like a pragmatic perspective, it's fair to say that a cell operates much more like a machine that is programmed to do a specific task and only that task unless it breaks. And as opposed to like a moral actor or an independent agent or something that can make its own impact onto the world outside of that programming. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. Now, of course, I'm going to have to throw this out here. We probably better not chase this trail, but I'm a panpsychist. So I go off into crazy areas in that respect.
Let me do a pass on comments and stuff because I got to be a good show host at the same time as trying to have this discussion. So Jim Jesus, another super chat for $2. Thank you, sir. He says Patrick is going to play with his daughter and smash the state in Minecraft in real life. Hell, wait, no, we don't, not in real life, in Minecraft, right? No, yeah, wait, yeah. And let's see a couple other comments here. Over on Odysee, my awesome channel asks, hey, is this the realist Christian guy? Yeah, I believe it is. If you saw the comments on the manifesto on Odysee, this is the guy in the comments. That's correct. Dr. CC says, when individuals obey, you will not send them out. I think you misunderstand peaceful parenting when I was describing what you just saw him do is the kid wanted to come in and he said, hey, if you want to come in my room, then here is the agreement that you have to agree to. And he asked him if he agreed, the kid agreed, and now they have a deal between them. And as long as he keeps the agreement, the kid can be in there. That's consensual relations between humans, and that's how we should be interacting with everyone, especially our children. And so that's why I praised him. He didn't say, get out. He didn't say, come in and sit down and shut up. He made a deal with him, and that was admirable, and I love seeing parents do that. So that's what happened. Shepard thinks that... Go ahead, what?
I was going to say, where possible, I think that is the best way to approach it with kids. Like, here a while back, we had a rattlesnake, and I was like, you do not do this. It's like, I'm putting a wall up. There's no negotiation. There's a few things where I'm like that. But for the most part, kids are people too. They are made in the image of God, and therefore they have the dignity implicit in that, and they should be treated as such.
Well, for different reasons, I absolutely agree. And that's why I do the Peaceful Parenting University, There's only the first season of videos is the only ones that are out. You can go find that channel. Anybody watching, Peaceful Parenting University, and we talk about the principles and the practice, the actual practical how-tos of parenting with principles. So I would invite anybody to go check that out.
I may actually look at it.
It's small and nerdy, and I had terrible hair back then. So, all right. So, let's see. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say we got off on the rabbit trail, so go ahead and keep going.
Yeah, one more. Shepard is asking who the guest is. This is somebody that disagreed with the manifesto in the comments of one of the videos, and he was invited on because that's what we do here on this channel. We take people with genuine criticism and a willingness to give us the benefit of their time. He's doing us a favor right now. He thinks we're wrong in some ways. And rather than just talk shit in the comments and evaporate like most people do, he actually is giving us the benefit of his time and is taking time to come on and engage with us. So we have the proper view on such things here on this channel. Okay, so now let's go back. Let's focus again. Sorry for the distractions. Go ahead.
We will probably be chasing many, many rabbits. I fully expect none of us will change each other's mind, and I will actually be disappointed if we do. We should not be so open-minded to fall out.
I will be excited if my mind has changed.
Well, I think you should. Anytime somebody gives something that changes your mind, you should examine it for quite some time before you change your mind. You don't change it right there in the conversation unless there's no other way of evaluating it.
I would like to think that I would have the wherewithal to know if I was wrong in the middle of the conversation, but you're probably right. That's how it usually happens. Yeah.
Yeah. Always be cautious.
Yep.
It's like the three maxims at the Oracle of Delphi: Gnos thyself, Tom, know yourself, which incidentally is probably not intended the way Socrates read it. It was probably more along the lines of know your role, mortal.
Oh, great. We're going down this rabbit hole. So this is the last one I'm going to talk about parenting for now. If you want to have a parenting episode, we can do that later. Crazy says it's the fact that you need the consent of the kid that makes me worry. No. He was asserting ownership of the room. It's his house. It's his room. He owns it. He gets to make the rules for entry into that space. And he made a deal with his kid rather than just be authoritarian like most people are, which is a good example. It teaches the kids property rights, property ownership, teaches kids negotiation. I'll tell you right now, my kids can out-negotiate a lot of adults because they've been negotiating their entire life for things that they want. It works. It's good. Anyway, okay, we're done with parenting. Back to state of nature. So, do we agree, or have we clarified sufficiently the state of nature conception qua anti-subjectivism?
I think we'll go down the rabbit trail just a little bit more.
Okay, go for it.
Because I actually believe y'all are close enough to Thomas Hobbes that the articulation you gave would still end in his model. But if you threw in the stuff I talked about, how humans in their natural habitat, which is pre-agricultural, hunter-gatherers, we can study them. And by the way, a book I'll recommend to y'all is, I can't remember it's Anarchy in Southeast Asia, resisting, I'll probably send it to y'all or something like that. But basically, it talks about how hunter-gatherer societies reinvent themselves to resist the state and resist its control.
Okay.
It's a really fascinating academic work. But if you modified your presentation of the state of nature to include the tribal nature of humanity, because we're not individuals and we're not collectives, we're tribal primates. And if you modify that and include this anthropological data, it will actually strengthen your case, if that makes any sense.
Oh, I'm certainly an individual, and I would definitely disagree with you there. And it sounds like you disagree with me. So can you make that case?
Yeah. Yes, I will. All right, son. Shh. Sorry. I would actually argue that, remember I told you earlier the story about the children in the experiment, that it was children's ability to cooperate. There's virtually nothing that no thought that you've had that actually arises from just you. You're almost always responding to and modifying other people's thoughts. But the thing about it is the two extremes are basically the collective and the individual. Nathaniel, you're going to get sent out if you keep that up. Remember, we said be quiet. Sorry. But
No, you're good.
those two extremes push off of each other. And I think that they're basically latching each one of them onto an individual truth. And this, incidentally, I know that we agree on this one. We get there by different methods. But I hate copyright. I think intellectual property is fundamentally evil and dehumanizing because it interrupts the human creative flow because we have to interoperate with each other. I see humans operating with a sort of circumcision with each other to where basically we are all persons. We're separate. But at the same time, we mentally, and I would add spiritually, I know you're a materialist, and so you're not going to buy into that, but we mentally, spiritually, and emotionally intercommune with one another, and we modify one another by doing that. And an individual by himself is actually reduced. You have to have other people to reach your full humanity.
Can I try taking this in a bit of a different, kind of circling back just a little bit? So we've said multiple times and we've established, and none of us have protested, so I assume we all agree, that humans are tribal primates, right? Well, primates are tribal primates, and that's not necessarily a characteristic that's like exclusive to humans. So would you say that any creature which engages in any form of this sort of I guess I'll just say tribal again, even though it just feels like I'm throwing the word out there until it, like loses meaning. But would any set of organisms that engages in this sort of behavior fall under this idea that you're talking about, where they don't classify as state of nature entities?
As y'all are defining it, yes. I think that eusociality in organisms is an intellectual as well as a sociological invention. It modifies the minds of all the organisms. I actually, for instance, I would think that ants would qualify as a single organism, the whole colony. So I think that this eusociality, when we evolved language, and I'm a theistic evolutionist from before you get the people saying, no. But that, I think, is
not young Earth creationist then.
No.
Okay.
Incidentally, right. I'll go off of this rabbit trail that will make y'all laugh. Okay. Young Earth creation, as it is currently presented, traces itself back to the Seventh-day Adventist prophetess, and in her interpretation, most people in the world, at least in the Western world, were old Earth people, and many of them were theistic creationists. And then they had some people write that stuff in, and almost all Christians would consider her a heretic, which is really kind of funny because the people that are most adamant that she would be a heretic are also the people that follow her interpretation the most closely.
Interesting.
Sorry, that's a rabbit.
Go ahead. So, Christian, go ahead.
Yeah, I do want to push back on one thing that you said, and actually, I'll phrase it as a question just so that I don't assume anything. Would you? And this is a leading question, but I don't know how else to ask it. But would you say it's fair to suggest that these social dynamics that are kept in place are either done through biological processes, so outside of the creature's cognitive capacity, which is why I might even be lenient to say the ants are a single organism thing because of the way that they interact with pheromones and whatnot that just override their entire nervous system, or these are hierarchies that are instituted by force. So in the example of chimps or wolves or sea lions or any other creature that you can think of, 90% of the hierarchies, I'll just go ahead and say, until you give me a counterexample, all of the hierarchies I can think of are instituted by force in a might makes right sort of a manner. So they cooperate in the same way that we cooperate with the government, right?
Well, I would, on that one, to some extent, on some of it would be true, but on ants, I think that ants operate like the cells in our body. Each individual ant operates like a cell, so I think it's entirely biological. But the might makes right rule for animal hierarchies is actually not nearly as well-founded as people think. Wolves do not operate on a might makes right. They've had some recent research over the past few years where basically they found that wolves who behaved that way because they were in containment by humans and responding to humans who basically pressured them into that direction. We force them to model our own demonic hierarchy. So wolves in nature don't do that.
Sorry, Patrick. I'm gonna have to. Last thing, and then I'll let you have some time. But I have to push back on this because it feels like we're at this point we're having like an epistemic issue, which is an important one. So like when I use an example like sea lions, and I just watched a really interesting video on sea lions, which is why they're at the top of my head. But like they have some brutal rituals built into like their social hierarchy, like mating customs. Frequently, males will die through these things, and it's not because like they literally are killing each other to mate with other females and establishing that social hierarchy. So maybe wolves don't. I will even concede that, but there are instances of creatures that do undergo this sort of like might makes right based social hierarchy, and I feel like to some extent, like we have to agree that this is a phenomenon that exists in reality, right?
I would agree that it exists in reality. I was pushing back a little bit with the wolves because we have a tendency to blanket all nature as this might makes right structure. And you really have a combination of eusociality, you have symbiosis, you have that sort of competition you're describing. And anytime you take one of them, people are usually omitting all the others. And it's really a composite image. And because of the way our mind works, we break them down. And it's important to caution our reduction by looking at the counterfactuals.
So I think that's the critique, Christian. Let me try and steelman his position. So let me know if I got it. So he's saying that when we negate the state of nature, we're taking might makes right and negating that into consent. And he's saying, no, wait, the state of nature also includes consensual and other forms of interactions between people. So negating that is not quite as simple as we made it out to be. How did I do on steelmanning you?
That's fairly good, and I would add one more element. The presentation of the state of nature, where you have just the might makes right, you're going to end in Hobbes' position. That is the inevitable conclusion of it. And so I don't think we can just derive consent being such a priority without modifying the state of nature presentation. Otherwise, you end in Hobbes. I don't think there's any logical way to get there with the state of nature you have.
Can you explain more with what you just said? Like,
right,
what do you mean by ending in Hobbes in relation to what you're saying?
Let's like I'm going to work with y'all's presuppositions, okay? At least as I understand them. I once again, I'm a firm believer. I'm not going to try to argue to believe in ethical realism or God right here. So, if you have where nature is all might makes right, then it's basically a function. We're transactional organisms at base. We rely on energy. Everything we do is a transaction of one form of energy for another. And therefore, it's all resource-based. It's hardwired into us. There's no way to escape that. And so if it's all might makes right, consent is a game theory when you're dealing with equals or where there's a fairly good chance that you can lose. But the moral game theory changes the minute you have more resources, clout, or ability to impose your theory, your view, because then might makes right is basically the way it is, and then you impose your order, and you have something a lot more like what Hobbes had. So consent in terms of a moral theory in an amoral universe, unless you have this eusociality in there, then it really is an entirely arbitrary insertion. Actually, I would argue that morality has to be arbitrary and subjective, and if you try to minimize that, you're making a mistake. But that would be another discussion.
Well, I mean, we agree that it's an arbitrary selection. You have to choose to elevate yourself out of the state of nature and to withhold yourself from acting as you would be genetically programmed to do, either forcefully, non-consensually, or just by going along to get along genetically, right? Both of those behaviors would be sort of like an unthinking state of existence where you just kind of you do as you were programmed to do. Whereas the people that are sort of choosing to elevate themselves are the ones rejecting that state of nature.
And that gets us back to our definition of nature, where it's how an organism propagates itself and prospers. Then in that case, if you're playing with equals, that is very much a state of nature. But if it doesn't bring prosperity, then you're running against nature, and running against nature is basically pissing in the wind.
But you can still choose to do it, right? Like I could be very wealthy, and I could even have a private army, and I could still choose to not force my order on everyone around me.
You would probably end up with a problem, because if you have a private army, that means you weren't like that before. that would be another one. But basically, I don't see it actually working. It would be the exception. Kind of like, how Nietzsche interprets Christ as an absolute aberration in history. And if we took that metaphysics and that view of state of nature, it would be like Nietzsche's view of Christ, where it would be an aberration, something unusual. And there was one guy, I can't remember who he was, but he basically said, my rights are whatever I have the strength for, and your rights end on what you can defend. And I believe you called him an asshole. But that would actually, I think, from the state of nature y'all are giving, that is basically the only way that it ends if you follow the values implicit within the state of nature through to their conclusions.
But you also agree that we can reject that. We can choose to be an aberration and reject that state of existence, right? That state of interaction.
Yes, I do. But I also believe that if you're an ethical system, I'll add this one in, because once again, ethics and morality is a lot like mathematics, where it's the variables you plug into it, and you can even change the formula some. I would argue, here I'm going to get into a little bit of natural law, a moral decision should lead to what is considered a good or a prosperous end. And so basically something that propagates itself, which is where we get into my definition.
This seems circular. This seems circular now. Hold on. I don't know what just happened. Go ahead.
It is going to be circular on almost everything. You assert your conclusion, and then you make your arguments to get there. In fact, a fun random tidbit is that all deductive arguments are begging the question. It's similar to that. Because you have your conclusion snuck into your major premise. Otherwise, it doesn't work. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. But since Socrates is included in all men, you have made an inductive argument and disguised it as a deductive argument.
Well, that only...
Okay, go ahead, Christian.
This is not important, but that only works if the intention of the term man includes mortal in its pretext. That's the only way that it's circular. So like the point of the Socrates is mortal deductive reasoning is to like, you're supposed to presume that we don't have like a well-defined intention that includes mortal in the term man. Obviously we do. So post rationalization, of course it's circular because it's correct. We're asserting an analytic statement and saying that, Socrates is a man and mortal. They mean the same thing essentially. So
yeah. So this is where we get into the point where each one of us gets stuck within a circular argument, because all ethical and moral arguments ultimately devolve into that. Because you have your conclusion that you're trying to argue going in. Like, I would actually, if you don't have a belief in free will, I would actually argue you can choose to would be an inconsistent argument in itself. Which, if you're a materialist, you probably don't believe in free will.
Okay, we have three threads going in this conversation in parallel. Yeah. We have the free will conversation. We have the free will thread that just started, and I want us to discard that for now. Let's return to the steel man I gave of his objection. Christian, do you have any thoughts on that?
I want to try tackling this from another area, because we're talking about a lot of this from like an epistemic basis, which I think is valuable, but perhaps we could reach the same conclusion by looking at it from a perspective of moral evaluation, or what reality. Lose my connection? I lost my connection. Sorry.
Okay, it was only like 2 seconds long. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, you're all back, Christian. We only lost you for a couple seconds. So go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, we posit from a moral context, which is possibly one of the most important aspects of the state of nature to us, that the state of nature has a moral value of null, and that is what facilitates the might makes right existence. So there are no deontological commitments that prevent anyone from acting in any way that they choose, and so might makes right is always within the capacity of an individual to choose as the set of possible actions. Now, in stating that, we can identify it as a moral. Well, actually, how about I stop there? Do you think it's possible to conceive the natural world, the reality as existence, as a moral null without an ethical framework to provide an alternative?
I would actually say that that's a question that's best left out for now, because I don't think that it makes very much sense to have the world as a moral null, but I'm operating with y'all's premises right here. I think that both the sociality of our species gives a moral framework in itself. It's just not one that can be reduced to a set of principles. It's one that you learn like you learn any other skill. And being a Christian, obviously, I'm a moral realist beyond that. So I don't think
that is fair.
That a moral null.
Sorry, I was just saying.
A moral null.
I keep interrupting.
Sorry. But a moral null doesn't make any sense with a eusocial primate species. I'm limiting it to that because that's what we have in common. A moral null doesn't make much sense with a eusocial primate species because we have some moral values and tribal behavioral patterns that are hardwired into us. So
let's take. Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. The wolves example. There was a case made earlier that we can have perhaps a similar. I don't want to straw man you, but we have a similar. They do not engage in what you believe is like a might makes right social hierarchy. So would you say that wolves are engaged in a moral process when they do this? And if they're not, how can we adequately separate what the wolves are doing in humans and there be this moral separation between their actions?
Well, for the sake of our conversation, I'm leaving out a universal moral realism and talking about it on a species level. Because once again, that's what we have in common. And I would say that we have a lot of overlap, but there are different species, so the dynamic works differently. I will say that a lot of what we see, the abuses and things like that, this is where I'm going to get really, probably going to take us at another tangent, is a lot of it is being organisms. One of the downfalls of natural law theory was that we discovered that organisms behave differently when they're put in different climates. So what brings prosperity, how an organism behaves, changes. And basically, I think that the invention of agriculture just screwed us over. We got caught in these really tight spaces, and human behavior changed. And so what we have early on changed once we hit into the agricultural city system. That's when we start getting slavery and things like that, because it's the only way to sustain it, and the brutal work ethic that the masters had to make in order to keep their grain quotas. And it just changed the human species biologically and psychologically. And so we're still dealing with the problems from that.
Okay, we are all over the map, and I feel like we're not getting anywhere because of it. So let's really try and focus. I feel like we had like a salient critique that maybe we could engage with your proposal that we're misconstruing the state of nature to oversimplify it. Can we stick on that until we get somewhere?
I'm sorry, I'm a little bit scatterbrained. The switching days and nights makes me that way.
I wasn't trying to talk shit. I'm just trying to make this as productive a time as possible. That's all.
Yeah, but basically the fact that we're tribal means that we're not a moral null. And because we can demonstrate behavioral patterns in humans that cross almost everywhere, and with our tribal structure, means that there is a base ethical system that works within our system. And once again, that's why I think you need to reference anthropological data. And it will actually support the consent priority that you give. To some extent. There are places where it would cut against it, but...
I guess I am including in the state of nature any kind of tribalistic behavior that a wolf would have, or humans might have. Like if you're making decisions based on your genetics and not on something that sets you apart from that nature. Like anytime I say state of nature, I'm including the things that you're talking about that exist in nature. A tribal behavioral pattern, for example, could be one of them. So if you're looking to be ruled by reason instead of genetics, so to speak, then that's what we're trying to nullify. That's what we're trying to oppose.
I don't think that's possible. You are a biological creature. You're matter.
But you conceded earlier that an individual at any time could choose to be that outlier and act differently than nature would specify. So it feels like you're contradicting yourself. You don't think it's possible, but you think it's possible.
Basically, I think we're going to have to talk about free will here. I know you wanted to avoid it, and I was trying to avoid it, but we got to talk a little bit about free will. I belong to the Maximian tradition on free will. Are y'all familiar with it?
Maximian? No, I'm not. Enlighten me.
It comes from St. Maximus the Confessor. But basically, our will, he divides our will into 2 points. There is the fundamental orientation of our will and what he calls the gnomic will. Because gnomic is so opaque in English, I call it the economic will. Basically, our will is organized irreversibly towards certain ends because we are biological creatures, and of course, him being a Christian philosopher, towards God, of course, but it's fundamentally oriented towards certain ends. But because you don't perceive the world correctly, and you deal with things, and the free will does allow you to resist certain desires and things like that, you are capable of making economic decisions on the spot, but the overall arch is in a specific direction. So I would say that we can't deny our bodily structure or autonomy, but we can choose on the spot to deny it, and we can find ways to work our economic decisions into it, and we will almost always be making those decisions in accordance with the fundamental orientation of our will as we understand it at the moment.
I mean, there's so many. I mean, you can come up with counterexamples pretty easily. Wouldn't that? Do you see that as a problem for your thesis there?
I don't think that there are that many salient counterexamples.
Well, I mean, for example, had I not been driven by reason, I would probably still be working for the Air Force, writing code for missiles and whatnot. Well, I wasn't writing code for missiles, but that's probably where I'd be by now. I would be very wealthy. I would be in a totally different line of work. I would have an entirely different circle of friends. My social structure wouldn't have been destroyed and reconstituted over the course of a 10-year period, suffering a lot of social tribalistic negatives that I, acted against what nature would presume to bring about in my life. So I mean, I make so many decisions counter to what would be my natural benefit on a near daily basis based on reason, based on philosophy. I'm not getting your point. Go ahead.
Where we get into the limits on our metaphysics, I'm not a materialist. And so the good transcends humans. One of the things that specifically sets us apart from wolves and stuff is we are capable of considering a good and orienting ourselves towards a good that is basically transcendent and immaterial. And you are still orienting your will towards what you consider good. It is still following its fundamental orientation, because the human will, I would argue, is oriented towards the good of your neighbor and towards ultimate good. And so in that situation, you are responding according to what you think is the good. You're still acting within the paradigm I described. The most popular example I gave is Augustine's pears, and it doesn't work that well either.
I've talked a lot, so Christian, you're welcome to jump in anytime you want, or I can continue. It's up to you, Christian.
Yeah, I just feel like that definition of free will could be applied to literally any living thing at all. Like you could let's go back to the cellular example, like with the machine, which I posited as a machine, which is, I guess, I suppose a debatable concept. But a cell's good is to not die and produce whatever that cell's function is and reproduce. That's basically all a cell does. And so we could orient the good of a wolf, or the good of a seal could be to kill its neighbor to mate, to reproduce. That could be its good. And so I know that you appeal to a higher good from a higher power, but given the context that we have, perhaps you are right that there is like a deeper metaphysical issue here that's like causing a major incongruency between our like theories of value. So,
well, I mean, if he's criticizing criticizing our theory from a foundation, a metaphysical foundation that we don't hold, then he needs to justify his metaphysics. You know, now we have to talk about the existence of God and all this other stuff before we can even begin to talk about anti-subjectivism, unless we are able to mentally set all that aside and criticize it on its premises.
The conversation inevitably went up against where we had the metaphysical differences. I had been trying to keep it within where we had the same thing.
Yeah.
But inevitably, because we have different views, the conversation evolved. And we did hit a metaphysical difference right there, and it's a pretty substantial one.
Okay, so give us, for the sake of this discussion, accept our metaphysics. Do you have any criticisms that remain?
Within your metaphysics, because I snuck it in without thinking, that once again hits the free will issue. In a materialist world, I don't think free will is a rational proposition. And if you don't have a rational proposition, then by definition, you cannot resist your nature.
Well, we have go ahead. Good.
Yeah, I think so. This is a really interesting conversation.
Look at the shirt I'm wearing.
Oh,
I just realized I'm wearing the AZA shirt. Guys, if you want this shirt, check out the Disenthrall swag store. Go ahead.
The free will conversation is one that is certainly, I think, interesting to get into, but I do feel as though there is a point where even if we can concede the fact that free will as some kind of higher force by which governs us based on, in your case, like a higher value system, or regardless, even if you're like a materialist and believe in free will, an arbitrary value system, I think we still have a rational basis for looking at entities within existence as independent actors and agents in that system. Even if we are, if you want to take the most cynical view on it, biological clocks that just like process data off of like hard-coded information, and if you roll back the clock, we do the same thing every single time. There's still an ethical case to be made as actors in a system of interpersonal relations that ethics still applies.
What I was going to say...
Go ahead.
What I was going to say to that was, if we are all deterministically behaving deterministically, then the only part of anti-subjectivism that needs to be talked about is like, look, we found a universalizable program that can resolve all conflicts in all times and places, and so it would be smart of us to install that program on as many other computers that we interact with as possible, so that we can reduce the conflict and hopefully all be more prosperous. That's what I would say. Go ahead.
But once again, that gets you that slight modification where you include the eusociality that we have built into us in the state of nature and include that in your definition. It gets around the free will question entirely. Because if that eusociality is built in and it's not all red in tooth and claw, then rather than working against the state of nature, we can focus a specific aspect of the state of nature, and it brings that consent in, and it can justify it. But as long as you do not have that built into the state of nature, you're not going to get there, I don't think.
My aversion to putting eusociality in with the state of nature is that we are, to some extent, granting eusociality like inherent moral qualities. And that's not a position that I hold. I think from your perspective, obviously there is something there. But again, coming at this from the framework that we are, that there is no moral standard, I mean, it is a subjective morality. The eusocial relationships are like at best just like a less offensive version of might makes right. I think you could strongly make the case that most of them are supported by might makes right fundamental principles, but they are nonetheless another version of a moral null.
For anybody listening, eusociality would probably be quintessentially described as like the way a beehive exists. That kind of sociality. So I just wanted to clarify that for anybody that wasn't familiar with the term. Go ahead.
Yeah, I pulled that term from social insects because simply saying tribal doesn't quite get in everything. But that gets into one of the criticism I've got with some of the people that they have a really cynical view of humans, where basically, like, if you give a gift, you always have an ulterior motive. And one philosopher I like, David Bentley Hart, in his Beauty of the Infinite, turned around his retort, I think was fairly nice. And he said, still the gift was given. And basically goes on to talk about that stuff is speculation. And then he also pointed out, I like this line, I think it's in the end of the third part. It's been about 20 years since I've read it. But basically he said that the difference between, say, St. Gregory of Nyssa's view about the beauty and the good of the human person and Nietzsche's view, it basically boils down to aesthetics. There comes a point where you adopt basically a moral null and you read everything as a moral null, or you adopt like the eusociality and things like that, and you use that, even if you're a materialist, as the basis of a moral system. But at the end of the day, you're going to end up with an aesthetic choice right there. I mean, I would love to say that there's a way to narrow that value judgment down, but I don't think there is.
I don't think I actually disagree that much with that idea, because ethics, like as we've posited in the manifesto, is something that you arbitrarily select as something that you value. Like this is like I don't, without getting into like the nuances of like the axiology of it, like metaethically, the biggest point of the paper is that you arbitrarily choose your system of ethics. Now, we make a couple of prescriptions about how we think a system of ethics should work that guides our rationality into choosing consent or discovering consent as the negation of the state of nature, I think would be a more apt way of putting it because of how we come to this determination. But at the end of the day, we have to make some kind of delineation in this kind of manner. Otherwise, I mean, the aesthetic thing is nice, and I think to a certain degree poetic, but it almost also sounds like it's kind of missing the point. If that makes sense.
Now we're going to get into some another area of where I would criticize, and this is where I'm moving outside of the framework. I've avoided it, but basically, I would argue that all morality is necessary. I'll say this as the moral realist in the room, which is going to make everybody my philosophy professors all called me the champion of situational ethics, but I would argue that all morality is necessarily subjective and to some degree arbitrary. All of it. And it's inescapably so.
You're a moral realist. Did I hear you right?
Yes. It really shocks people when they find that out.
I'm not shocked. I just don't know what the hell you're talking about now. So you're going to have to, yeah.
I say that as the person right there, but what I'm saying, where I'm going is that it's not possible. And I think it is definitionally not possible to have a moral system that is not arbitrary and subjective at almost every point. Like even the priority y'all gave the state of nature and the definition you gave is both arbitrary and subjective. The values you plug into the logic is arbitrary and subjective.
So, hold on. We were using state of nature to describe reality. And so you're saying that that is arbitrary and subjective.
You're slicing out portions of reality that you emphasize and not using others.
Like
the
what?
Very act, like we've been talking about eusociality the entire time. I could go into symbiosis, but the thing about it is anytime you make a presentation of facts, what makes bias inevitable is you have to make a selection on what you emphasize just because the total picture is too big. And so even on your state of nature, the way you're presenting it is necessarily arbitrary because of what you leave out, and it's subjective because of basically it's context sensitive.
I'm not entirely sure we're leaving eusociality or anything or these other aspects out. I need to think about that though for a bit. Christian, go ahead.
Yeah, I think not putting us into another rabbit hole, but just like focusing this conversation. What this really is like a critique of like the capacity for knowledge and argumentation. Like this is another thousands of years old metaphysical question of like, how can you say to have any true statement without a full context of all things in all places and all times? And I could make gestures to people like Carnap or Wittgenstein as far as like how frameworks can help posit like epistemic perspectives on the world or like an epistemological basis for us having what we can reasonably define as truth. But there has to, I'll put it this way. I agree with you in the extent that your logic is sound, that to have true certain knowledge of any particular thing, you must have complete and true understanding and knowledge of that system. However, the framework perspective of rationalization and cognitive processing that we use, which I would recommend anybody to read some Carnap if you're more interested in like what this looks like in more of like a linguistic practice or outside of the realm of ethics for like a more clearer picture. There's a strong case to be made with the utilitous aspect of knowledge as that which is inductively reasonable. Because if we don't use knowledge as this, we kill so many parts of the world that we live in an absurd reality, one which cannot have internal consistency, et cetera, yada, yada. We lose natural kinds and inductive reasoning dies and the rules of logic are no longer sound and then everything falls apart. So I said a lot of words there. What's that?
Yeah, the more large words that we use, the higher the view count on the stream. Just so you know.
Yeah.
Not true. It's the opposite. But go ahead.
I used a lot of jargon there to say basically I'm making what comes off as a pragmatic appeal, but is actually a metaphysical case for cohesion of reality staying as a prime concept that we ground things under. So
I would agree with you pretty much entirely, but the reason why I made my point wasn't so much to say that we can't have a good grasp of reality or that these things aren't true, but that as human persons, there is a necessary subjective and arbitrary element to everything. And I think y'all agree with that because y'all made a point of that in your second point. And so I don't think it is even rational to be opposed to subjectivism because subjectivity is basically contextual. A squared plus B squared equals C squared is a subjective statement because the values you plug in at any given situation are different.
The only reason it's still subjective, it's on the margins, is just because we're not omniscient. Like, we don't have. Not even an omniscience
question. It's literally not an omniscience question. It is in itself subjective because the value of any two of those can be changed, but it's subjective within the rules that are applied. So subjective is contextual. We in our popular culture we conflate it, but subjective is contextual. My speed is subjective when I'm going down the street. I'm going 60. Another guy's coming to me going 60. But from his vantage point, I'm going 120. It is necessarily subjective, but within the rules of the game. And arbitrary is basically you get to make decisions.
So go ahead.
In these examples, the subjective, we'll say perception. That's a dirty word in metaphysics, but I'll say it here. The subjective perception that we're seeing here is based on some kind of objective is. Like A can be all of these kinds of numbers, but for the formula, A is 12. We define A. The speed of a car in relation to me is quote unquote subjective. It's 40 miles an hour slower or faster. But an independent outside camera can determine that it is going 120 or 100 or whatever it is. So I agree with you that there is subjective connotations to the perspective of these things, but they have to, in some extent, be grounded in reality. Otherwise, they're arbitrary to absurdity, to the point of meaningless, incapable of sense-making.
See, I would agree with you, But I'm emphasizing that because that's why I emphasize like the mathematical formula within the rules of the game. You can't take a squared plus b squared and then have c squared where it doesn't match up with a squared and b squared. The Pythagorean theorem disallows that at the outset.
But we called out very clearly that we assume existence exists and A is A. Yeah. And so we're sort of like we declared all of our variables and stood on the all of the sciences that also use those to make all their predictions. So it's not like we're just willy-nilly arbitrarying our way through this thing. In fact, like I would challenge you to give me an ethical framework that has less arbitrary assertions involved or subjective assertions than ours.
Well, the reason why I made my comment right there is that I would argue that subjectivity has to be embraced. See, I'm not saying that you weren't trying. Subjective is contextual. It is specifically contextual. You laid out rules, and then you followed those rules within your conclusion. And the only place where I'm really saying it breaks down is the state of nature. And arbitrary is when you make decisions, and you're selecting what you include and don't include, and that is purely arbitrary. So I'm not saying you break the rules of reality. I'm saying that these are elements that, rather than opposing them, it's best to embrace them and to discuss where in the framework they belong.
Okay, so I'm being called. I'm being called, so I'm going to put my headset down for a second. But maybe I'm going to let you and Christian speak for a moment. But then I think one of the things I would like to hear to challenge you would be to say, okay, to clarify the problem that you see in anti-subjectivism, can you tell us how you think we should change it specifically that would resolve your problems when I get back? So you guys talk amongst yourselves. I'll be right back. Sorry.
It's a great conversation. I'm really enjoying it. There's very few people on planet Earth that you could sit down with and talk about like the nuances of metaphysics with. So
I am more classically trained. So most of my thoughts will be oriented towards the classical world and traditional Christian theology. So to some extent, there's going to be a disjoinder, but I try my best in order to make the bridge.
Yeah, I feel like I'm pretty well read on the classics, but I've gained a much stronger base in contemporary philosophy over the last year. And so when I reference people like Carnap, it's because, well, I just got done reading one of his books. So, and one that I thought was very good.
If you want to get people and teach them some rules of logic, there's a fun site called carnap.io, which has an open source framework written in Haskell, which is really good at teaching it.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, Carnap is known as like one of, if not the best logical positivist ever. And I think, I think he makes a lot of really salient points about the way frameworks operate and whatnot. But I digress. Sorry, we have an agenda. So
yeah.
You're muted.
I'm just trying to keep us on track because we're coming up on an hour and a half. So let's keep it moving.
Totally fair.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to get us off track for a while, but my two primary critics, actually three places where I would say you could improve it, because obviously I'm not coming as an opponent who just disagrees with everything. We're very similar in terms of our ethical frameworks. One of them is make the definition of reality, when you define it and you state it outright, make it more functional, because even the solipsist will be caught up in it unless they're just really hardcore I'm going to be consistent with it, because almost everybody lives in the same functional reality. It's what goes beyond the experienced reality that people question. And I have had a few people who would push back on that were on the solipsist bent, but it doesn't take long to get them to break down. I would also say that make the modifications to the state of nature, because the eusociality gives a strong value to consent built into it. And then also find a place, because when you name it anti-subjectivism, you're making it sound like subjectivism and arbitrariness are inherently bad, and a lot of the rhetoric is, but they're an inescapable part of it. That's like when people say sex is bad. You shouldn't be thinking about sex. Well, I'm sorry, you're going to see the hot girl and you're going to think about it.
I've got to remember to ask questions like I just did more often, because that was the most clarifying 30 seconds of this stream for exactly where your problems with anti-subjectivism are. So your number 2 was to make sure that the state of nature or description of reality had a larger scope, to make sure we included everything so that we couldn't be accused of subjectively excluding things or subjectively cherry picking parts of reality that we like. Okay.
And without it,
go ahead.
Without that qualification, I do think you end up in Hobbes. I think that qualification really strengthens your argument. And then, like I said, it's not necessarily subjectivism isn't bad. Arbitrariness isn't bad. It's a fundamental part of all human thinking.
That was your number 3. Hold on, I want to stick on number 2 before we go back to number 3. So, I'm not convinced that we don't already include everything that you've listed. I'm going to think about it more, and I appreciate the challenge. But I'm unconvinced that we don't already include those types of socialities in the conception of state of nature. Maybe Christian, if you disagree, you're welcome to speak up. And I'm definitely going to think about it more later. So let's do that. Christian, do you have anything else you want to say on that? And then we'll go to his number 3.
I think we definitely don't explicitly mention them. If
agreed.
Part of the posit is that they're like irreconcilable parts of nature that must be addressed, and we're doing a disservice to the topic by not addressing them. That might have some levity there as far as just giving them a nod. But I do think it is implicit in our conversation of the state of nature that these, what I would consider moral null relationships qualify under the term that we've stated. But I think we've treaded that ground enough. I'm just kind of like reaffirming where I currently stand.
We went over for about 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And the last one is you can't, like I said, being opposed to subjectivism and arbitrariness is like people being opposed to sex. You're a sexual being. You're going to think about it, and there's no use in making it dirty and naughty because it's a fundamental part of your nature. The question isn't so much should you be arbitrary and subjective, it's what is the proper role. And when you make it anti-subjective, it basically is fundamentally opposing an inherent part of humanity.
I think I can answer this one pretty quickly. We have a section in the document where we very clearly outline that there are arbitrary selections that are fine. And I know the naming is spicy. The naming is spicy a little bit because it makes it sound like all arbitrary everything or all subjective and arbitrary everything is bad always. But that's not the position that we take in the text. Like we talked about.
I don't think his criticism was on our allowances for a subjective Metallica album. I think he's saying that even fundamental, logical decisions must include subjectivity because we're subjective beings. Am I steelmanning you well?
Yes. Basically, logic doesn't present truth at all. It cannot present truth. Logic carries truth from your premises to its conclusion. Logic is truth neutral. Socrates, all men are pink with purple polka dots. Socrates is a man. Socrates is pink with purple polka dots. If you outlined that with with symbolic logic, it would pass.
But we didn't start in the middle. We started with A is A from the fundamental consistency of reality. So if there's something we missed in that starting point, or if there's something we smuggled in that starting point, then so too has all the scientists smuggled it in.
But you're missing what I'm saying.
Okay, sorry.
That,
I'm not trying to, I promise. I'm really trying to understand. And I gotta say, I'm loving this discussion, so thank you again for your time.
Well, thank y'all for having me. I like to argue, and I'm having fun. But by naming it anti-subjectivism and talking about how poisonous subjective and arbitrary decisions are in an ethical framework, it really slants things in such a way that it makes them seem bad, and it's better to talk about their proper role than talk about how much damage they do, because, like I said, it's talking about in that way is like talking about sex is bad. It's a fundamental part of human life.
Well, I'm owning that position that you're saying we shouldn't own. I think it's bad. Change my mind. How is it not bad in a moral equation to have subjectivity? It defeats the purpose of the whole system. You might as well not worry about morality and just go with how you feel.
That's where we're going to get into. I'm going to not chase that rabbit trail right there because that'll take us off into another crazy tangent for about 45 minutes. But basically, my argument is that it's an unavoidable part of human nature. And so it's if I talk about aging is bad, aging and disease is bad, I can talk about that till I'm blue in the face, but it's much better to talk about how to minimize the damage from it and what the proper role for that is in the human life, because it's just there. You can't avoid it.
But this is frustrating. This is the second time we've come back to this counterpoint. You have agreed with me that I can act opposed to, I can be an outlier, I can be an exception, and then you also just say it's unavoidable. Those are contradictory, right? What am I missing?
No, you're equating two different things.
Okay.
I am saying that avoiding and not having arbitrariness and subjectiveness into your value judgments or into your knowledge or anything like that is as basic a law of human nature as I cannot be in two places at one time. And so it's not like when we're talking earlier about what you can decide and what you can't decide, it's a fundamental aspect of how you think. And you can't eliminate it.
So you're saying it's impossible to act rationally?
I didn't say not act rationally. Okay. You're defining rationalism in a way that I don't think is sustainable. Logic, like I said, only carries truth. It doesn't establish it. And if rationalism requires that you do not have subjective or arbitrary elements, and if that is what rationalism means, then yes, rationalism is impossible. But I don't think that's an inherent part of the definition.
Go ahead, Christian.
That's something.
So we talk about this a little bit as far as like what our focus primarily for anti-subjectivist perspectives are, and so let's talk about I'll even just for the sake of this conversation right now concede, like, let's just say logic is just a truth carrier. It in itself reveals no truth and is no truth. Okay, the premise that we start with, and this is the one that Patrick has referenced multiple times, that literally everything in all of the sciences build themselves upon and would destroy everything if it's not true, is that having an epistemological foundation to then logically build off of is the best way to produce consistent and accurate results in a reality for any given system. This is like a premise in so many things that we do that to deny it is to deny essentially living life. That's a bit poetic, but I think you get what I'm saying.
The thing is, you need to be more clear on that and rather than articulating it as something inherently bad. Own the fact that it's a necessary part of human nature. That part is not very prominent because basically you can't just kick against the pricks. That this is what human nature is. I agree with all your points right there, that we have to work within our common reality. And so I'm not disagreeing with you. This is a rhetorical criticism. It's not a substantive criticism.
Oh, so your biggest point here is that we didn't harp on like that specific goal enough, like the premise of epistemic goals fundamentally being required for a systematic and repeatable results in reality when the system is applied. I think I fumbled through that, but maybe you could.
Well, basically, it's. I think that you approached it as if it's something that needs to be eliminated from the human person, and we only have it because we have to make a few foundational assumptions. But because it's such a big role in the human person, because you come off giving that, I think it would be better to include some of the positive structures with it, because it. Sorry, my throat is getting dry. But I think that basically you will communicate better by talking a little bit more about that. Like I said, it's not a substantive criticism. I didn't come into this to really falsify anti-subjectivism. I'm actually trying to come in here to strengthen y'all a little bit.
Oh, and hey, like, if it feels adversarial, it's
oh yeah,
not in a mean way. Yeah,
I think at this point we're miscommunicating. I think part of the reason is everybody's getting tired.
Okay, well, I mean, hey, we can bring it to a close. Why don't we do? Do you want to do closing statements, and we'll give our guest the last word? Christian, you want to start, or do you want me to go first?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I can go. I think I think this was an awesome conversation. I'm super glad that we had it. Like I kind of said when you were away, Patrick, it's very rare that you can get humans together to talk about these kinds of things at this level of like mutual understanding with one another. So rare, in fact, that it's moments that I cherish. So I'm very glad we got to have this conversation. I just like closing thoughts in general. I definitely will spend some time thinking about how these other aspects of relations that you've brought up are involved in our conception of the state of nature. Like I said in the outset, I think that's probably the critique that you had that most interested me, just because of how fundamental it is to the entire formulation. If the state of nature is wrong, or our conception of it is wrong in some way, then or misleading or incomplete, then the entire formulation falls apart as a fundamental negation. So I definitely appreciate you bringing that level of concern to the conversation, because that is a super critical one. And regarding your final point with ensuring that we have a clear and poignant position on the role of arbitrariness and subjectivity in relation to both systems and human nature, I think that's also something that I'll spend some time thinking about and seeing if there's ways that we could tweak, because especially since it is more of a critique of the presentation of the paper, I think it's something that we could do without compromising anything that we've already established. So,
okay, my turn. State of nature, I think is I don't want to just repeat what Christian said. It is a core pillar of the argument, and you have brought some questions around it. My initial reaction, like we talked about in the beginning, is that I think we're good there, but because it's such an important thing, I'm definitely going to be giving it some thought. I'm just repeating what Christian said, so same. The second thing I'll say is thank you for giving us the benefit of your time and your brain power. Most people in the world won't do that, especially on the internet, especially in the comment section of videos. You are a rare person that I treasure and appreciate for doing what you're doing here. I have completely enjoyed this conversation, and to that end, I want to hold this conversation up as another one on this channel that should serve as another example, because we've had many of these on Disenthrall for the past 12 years, where we take debates, we take people that disagree on things, and we have good, healthy conversations where nobody's butthurt, nobody's talking shit. It's productive. It makes you think. It is possible, guys. It's possible, and this is another example of those. And so every time you disagree, or so you see in the comments, go look at some of my videos in the past, and you'll see the people that are just nasty in the comments. And I still respond, and I'm like, hey, if you really think you have me, or you think I'm wrong on something, come on the show and let's talk through it. And then they respond like, oh, you just want to bully me on your show, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, dude, you don't know what is possible. This guy took us up on the offer, and look what came of it. We got 2 hours of really badass conversation that I think any philosophy nerd would enjoy. So that's what's possible. That's what we do on Disenthrall. The last thing I'll say is that Disenthrall is like my people. Y'all are my people. This audience, the people that watch this channel, you guys grew up with me in the channel, and you're here because this is the content you enjoy, and I love each and every one of you for being that type of person. That's awesome. The thing I wanted to say, and this is a side topic for the viewers of this channel and also Anarcast, the much larger channel. I have not been feeling as much like that channel is my home. It's not my people. I'm interviewing people that I don't necessarily have as much interest in talking to as the stuff we do here on Disenthrall. And so I just want to tell you guys, as like the insider audience, the tiny, small core audience that's been with me since the beginning, I want to let you know that I'm probably going to change up Anarcast soon. I'm not happy with where it's at, so I'm going to change it because I'm not going to spend my lifespan doing things that I don't enjoy, and that's one of them. So we're gonna change it up. If you have suggestions on how to change it up, let me know. I want your feedback. I still want to interview people in Anarcast, but it's got to be different somehow. Anyway, okay, so that's my final statements. So I'll give the last word to you. Go for it.
Well, I thank y'all. I enjoyed the conversation. I tend to like a good argument. I mean, after all, I converted to my Christianity because of an argument. I converted to my church because of an argument. I met my wife by writing 20-page argumentative essays after calling her Bible dictionary garbage. And yes, that was our courtship. We wrote 20-page argumentative essays against each other. And so I've enjoyed the discussion. I didn't expect to change anybody's mind. That wasn't actually my aim. My aim was to strengthen the argument a little bit. And I'm glad y'all had a discussion. And I tried to stay off of weird, crazy land where we had strong metaphysical differences. And I apologize for the places where we ran up against it. But
you did well. You did far better than most other people would. Most people wouldn't even accept the we'll say the rhetorical game of playing within the metaphysical boundaries of the framework. So I did forget to thank you for that, but that is also another super rare thing. So,
well, thank you. I still failed at the task on a few occasions, but I appreciate it, and I like an argument. And you asked before the show, and I didn't get a chance to answer how I ran into you. Yeah, I found you by a side link in Odysee. Well, not Odysee, in library. And so I came in, I asked, because I work at my job, I work for where I can listen to stuff for about 6 to 8 hours a day. I do computer support for grocery stores, and it's at night. And so I don't talk to people. So I just play stuff in the background because a lot of it I know by rote. And so you recommended a book, a series of anarchist authors, which they defined anarchy a lot broader than I would. But I listened to that, and then I listened to a few podcasts here and there afterwards, and that's how I found your show. But I hope y'all have a good day. And I apologize for cutting it off. Like I said, I'm getting tired, and I know my son is waiting for me, and it's getting close to his bedtime, and I do not want to break my promise about I'm going to play with you.
Hell no. I owe your son for your time today. Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate it. Christian.
Y'all have a
Thank you, Christian. As always, appreciate it. I always enjoy our conversations. Thanks for coming on.
All right.
No problem. Take it easy.
All right, guys. Thanks for watching. It was fun. I hope you enjoyed it. This is the kind of content I like. This is it. This is what I want to do. And so I'm just going to do that for a while, and we're going to enjoy ourselves. So thanks for watching, everybody. Have a good one.